Hi there. Often at Lokad, we're asked what are the key data requirements needed in order to work with us. Today on Lokad TV, we're going to investigate the exact depth of data that is required to work with us and also understand some of the real shortcomings that some of our customers have faced. So Johannes, why is it that customers aren't quite able to work with the Lokad technology?
So, data is indeed probably one of the biggest challenges in practice. It should not be, but it usually is. And the key insight is that the data that you need to operate your company is just you only need like the instant state of your company. If you want to start doing like quantitative supply chain optimization, you need to have like the entire history. Not entire like going back in the past for 2 decades, but you certainly need a certain depth, and you also certainly need a certain level of detail in your history. And it turned out that for many companies that had not really succeeded at setting up such a system in the past, or where it hasn't even been tried, they haven't necessarily paid attention to all the details to have all the relevant data, and so they might be facing, I would say, complication when it comes to actually gather all the relevant data so that they get really relevant results as well.
So we talk about that sort of depth of history. What is the sort of the minimum time frame of depth of history you should have?
So the depth of history depends on the type of data and type of business that you have. First, I would say, as a rule of thumb, let's start with basic rule of thumb. If you have less than a year, then basically it's very hard for Lokad to capture any seasonality. But it's not true only for Lokad, that would be true for any statistical method. If you have less than a year, then basically you have not observed the yearly cyclicity of the company. So if you want to have that, you can use relatively fancy techniques to start looking at seasonality with only 18 months. In reality, it will start working correctly with 2 years and start working very well with 3 years. But then the amount of depth of history that you really need also depends on your lead times. So if your lead time is like 1 day, then probably you can work just fine with just 2 months of history. Because fundamentally you don't really care about seasonality that much. If you have like 1 day of lead time, that basically you're thinking 1 day to the next, and when you enter, let's say, the Christmas season, you will gradually phase into the Christmas season, and it's okay not to be super good at properly forecasting seasonality. But if your lead times are like 4 months ahead, then it becomes much more important to capture this seasonality. So as a rule of thumb, if you want something that works, I would say, nice, you would need to have at least probably something like 10 times your applicable lead times worth of history. So if your lead times are 1 day, you can literally work with very, very short history. If your lead times are 6 months, then you need, I would say, a much deeper history. But in practice, also, one thing that to keep in mind is that when the forecast is done manually, there is no magic happening. So if you do not have the data, the statistical forecast is not going to be very accurate. But the reality is that the supply chain manager who is doing it manually is not going to be very accurate either. So I'm just describing things to have good forecasts in general. But fundamentally, the bottleneck that you will face will be the same whether you're using like a statistical method like Lokad or just do everything manually.
Okay, so let's talk about the data itself now. So Lokad, we kind of work on 4 key data sets, don't we? So the key data sets are the catalogue, the purchase order history, the sales history, and also a snapshot of current stock levels. So let's kind of look at these in a little bit more detail. If we start off with the catalogue itself, why is this of interest? I mean, surely our clients have got a pretty good understanding of what it is they're selling and the exact details on that. So what more can be said about this catalogue?
So the catalog is a very, I would say, very important, of prime importance for Lokad, because our forecasting technology can take advantage of the relationship there is between products to refine the forecast of every single product. I mean, last week we were discussing about forecasting new products, and the idea is that when you're forecasting new products, you don't have any sales history. So the only things that you can rely on are the attributes, the things that describe the products. And the reality is that we are extensively using these techniques also for products that have already been launched. So for example, we were just discussing about seasonality. What about a product that has been sold for 3 months? The question is, can you apply a seasonal, a seasonal pattern to the projected demand for this product? The answer is that if you only look at the history of this product, you can't, because you have just 3 months. But if your business has been around for years, then you can look at comparable products and detect what kind of seasonality they have, so that with only 3 months of history plus the attributes that you have on the products, you would be able to infer the applicable seasonality for this product, which we do. So that's why the catalog is very important. And when we say the catalog, we mean things like product categories, product hierarchies, product attribute like potentially size and color, those sort of things that really describe in an abstract way the product. We can also process the plain text label if it's present, and that can help in some domains where the catalog itself is poorly structured. But the gotcha is that we extensively need all those attributes, so that we can operate all those correlations, so that we can refine the forecast for every single product, even if the amount of information we have on this very product in terms of sales history and sales depth is limited.
Okay, so let's talk about sales history. Assuming from a forecasting perspective, probably sales history is the most important thing to sort of look at. So we're sort of talking about what's been ordered, who's ordered it, when it's been ordered, where it's been ordered. What sort of other information are we interested in other than that?
So the first trick is to make very sure that your sales history is complete, and it can be incomplete in many ways. Many ways, subtle ways. One way to have like an incomplete sales history is if you do not have the sales data from products that you do not sell anymore, or correspondingly, if you do not have the product information associated to those sales data. So the idea is that to have a complete sales history over the, let's say, last 3 years, you need to make sure that you have all the sales that did happen at the time with the product information that include, products that you're not selling anymore. And typically that can be a gotcha, because in setups that we see, it happens once in a while that we see a setup where the products that are not being sold anymore are purged from the catalog and the sales history, and so you end up with a sales history that comes with massive bias, where the things that are not being sold anymore are not readily available in the history. Another thing that is also a bit subtle about the sales history is to remember when you did start selling a product. Because you see, there is a trick, is that the sales is not the demand. So you have all sorts of biases, because you would say, oh, sales is a pretty good approximation of the demand signal. Yes, but there are subtle, I would say, gotchas, such as first, it's very different in terms of you start selling a product, you have zero demand for a month, and then you finally start 1 unit, or you start selling a product, and the same day you sell 1 unit. So you see, in terms of projected demand, if the same day where you put a product online, bam, 1 unit ordered the first day, well, it means that most likely you might end up selling 1 product a day. That's not an unreasonable guess. I mean, after all, the first day you sold 1. If you put a product online and then you have to wait 1 month to sell your first unit, well, most likely you will be selling like 1 unit per month. So you see, so But here, how does the statistical engine can make the difference? It can the forecasting engine can only make the difference between the two situations if you had properly, recorded the date when the demand actually started. Same thing for the end date where you stop selling the product. I mean, did it drop suddenly because you have a pattern where clients literally move on suddenly to a new, better product? So something stops selling abruptly because literally there are market conditions that trigger this abrupt drop of demand, or did it stop abruptly because you actually took it off your online catalog or off the store, off the shelf, so it could not be sold anymore? So same thing, you need to have like a proper recording of the end date. And then there might be also other twists if you actually have the products that goes on and off, or if you actually have the product that is on sales but not necessarily on all your channels. So if you're selling on physical stores, online, maybe through B2B channel extra, you need to kind of have, along with your sales history, also to record the history of what was like the factor influencing the demand, such as which are the channels that are available at any point of time, this sort of things.
Okay, let's sort of move on now to sort of purchase order history. I guess sort of the nice thing about looking at the history of a purchase order is you can see how much you've paid for various items of stock. So I'm assuming we use that and kind of forecast going forward what is the likely price we're going to pay for an item. Is that correct?
So it depends. I mean, because the likely price depend on I mean, again, supplier for most verticals, the price you pay with suppliers is relatively stable. You can have surprises, which comes from typically the fact that your supplier is giving you a quote for a price that is not necessarily in your own currency. So for example, you might end up with a quote in yuan while you're actually selling stuff in euro or dollars. And if there is like a 15% fluctuation of just the currencies, the rates between currencies, then you get the surprise. You can have a good surprise where things are significantly cheaper or more expensive.
So is that something we can include in the forecast, that kind of currency fluctuation?
I mean, again, depend on what you want to forecast. That will have an impact, but not necessarily on your demand forecast. It will more have an impact on the type of, on the way you optimize your decision on top of the forecast. Because you see, the thing is, if your margin for a given product is higher or smaller, you would not take as much inventory risk on it. Just to give you an idea, if you have an item that has like massive margin, it's literally a crime to have a stock out. Because you see, if let's say the extreme case, you have like a 95% margin, so it's like pure margin. Why would you ever risk to have a stock out on that? Literally selling one unit pays for the overstock of 20 other units or something. So literally, this is you want to be literally overstocked if you have items that are steadily selling with such a crazy margin. On the other hand, if you have a 5% margin, I mean, if you have a bit of overstock, it will take like a huge amount of sale. One unit overstock needs 20 units being sold to compensate for the money that you've frozen into the one extra unit in stock. So you better be very careful with how much you have in stock, because if you end up doing an inventory write-off, it's going to be very, very costly. So bottom line is, yeah, I mean, we would typically not forecast the future margin because it depends on so many things that, I mean, we can, but it depends on this. Typically, it's not the prime thing because nobody can really forecast the currency fluctuation, or rather the only people who can directly trade on the market to make money out of the expected, on forex trading extra. So that's not our specialty. So we don't Lokad, we don't pretend to be better than the market at doing forex trading. Okay. Otherwise, we would.
So let's move away from sort of trading then. In terms of purchase order history, yes. What else is of interest?
So what is really of interest is typically the dates involved. So when that was the date of the purchase order, and one was the date of the delivery, because that gives you the lead times And when you want to project, to optimize your supply chains, you need to think of all your decisions are, I would say, lead time dependent. So the lead times are varying, seasonal. For example, they can have seasonality where you have some busy periods for your suppliers where they're not as effective. It can be seasonal according to the Western calendar, but they can also be seasonal according to the East, to the more, I would say East calendar, like with the effect of the Chinese New Year that can add like 2 weeks of lead times to production that are coming from China or Asia in general. And here we have also other subtle catch, such as, for example, if you order 100 units and your supplier deliver 80, do you record this information? If you have like quality control where the supplier deliver 100, but 20 units do not pass quality control. For example, that can happen in food. For example, for fresh food business, you typically have, when you have like fresh fruits, let's say something that is very easy to damage, like strawberries, you can end up with 20% of the shipments that you receive that do not pass quality control. And that can be anticipated because every year, all shipments of strawberries will have a certain fraction that do not meet quality control. So you can anticipate this fraction. So if your need is 100, then maybe you should order 120 because you know ahead of time, statistically speaking, that 20% will not pass quality control. This sort of thing. So the purchase orders, the things that are a bit subtle and that are not always being done good is really taking care of the dates so that you can have the lead times, taking care also of all, I would say, the shenanigans that you can have on the quantities where the supplier might do mistakes and deliver more or less, or have problems with quality control. So it's this level of granularity that you're really interested in.
Okay, so that brings me nice and neatly on to sort of the last piece of the jigsaw, which is the snapshot of a current sort of stock level.
Yes.
We basically know what the purchase history was. We also know what the sales history was. We've got clever people here at Lokad. We've got some intelligent supply chain scientists. I mean, do you really need that current snapshot? I mean, can't they generate that from the other two histories?
Yeah, I mean, in theory, indeed, in theory, you could reconstruct the stock levels just by knowing exactly how many units came in, how many units went out, and that would give you, your theoretical stock level at any point of time. The challenge is that, unfortunately, inventory inaccuracies happen once in a while. And if the only thing that you do is to kind of replay the entire history to figure out all the stock levels, then those inaccuracies would pile up over time to a point where it's like vastly inaccurate. So in practice, you need to have like inventory snapshots, and you need to have like inventory controls. So typically, first we need to have like the current stock levels, otherwise we don't know what to order or what to manufacture. If you don't know what you have right now, you cannot just rely on the projected future demand to pass a purchase order. You have to take into account what you already have. If you have already a mountain of stuff, even if you project very high demand, you might not reorder just because you have already vastly enough. So you need the present stock level. But the trick is that you typically need the past stock levels because it goes back to the sales history. The sales are not the demand. If you had like a stock out, then basically you had no demand or no observed demand for probably days, but it's not because there was no demand, it's just because you could not service the demand. So having the historical stock level is the way to know basically your historical stock outs. And the situation can be a bit tricky because if you take, for example, the case of a do-it-yourself store, then let's say, for example, people want to buy, something like a door handle. And they have an apartment and they want to have like 5 door handles that looks exactly the same. And the thing is that if they walk into your store and they find a door handle where there is only 3 of them that looks exactly the same, they are not going to buy 3 and hoping that if they go into another store, they will find 2 that looks exactly the same. They would just say, either I can find 5 that are looking the same, or I walk away and try to find another store that sell me 5 that looks exactly the same. So stock out is not necessarily a binary thing where it's either you have exactly 0 unit and you're stock out, or you're good. Sometimes people are seeking, depending on the vertical, specific quantities, so you have a more fuzzy notion of the stock out. So that's why you need the historical stock levels. And also, the historical stock levels can be also of interest to automatically detect the most likely inventory inaccuracy, stock record inaccuracies that you have for your inventories. For example, if suddenly you have a stock level that goes into the negatives, for example, you're already at 0 in theory, but then you keep selling stuff. Probably, if stuffs are still coming out of your warehouse or your store with negative stocks, then maybe the electronic record of the stock level was incorrect. And that frequently happens for a variety of reasons.
Okay, so we've spoken a lot now about sort of the core data sets, kind of the main data sets that Lokad kind of requires.
Yes.
How about sort of those secondary data sets? Is there anything that could also be of interest to us there?
Yes. Yes, that the core transactional data set, the one that we have reviewed, I would say the second circle is probably everything that is related to, I would say, promotional activity and all the things that and promotions in the sense, I would say, a very basic sense of the word, which is to promote as to put forward. It's not just a matter of pricing, it's also what you promote on your various channels. So for example, an e-commerce can do promotions that is just the product, the 5 products that end up listed prominently in the newsletter that has been sent to the entire customer base. So that's a sort of promotion, even if it doesn't come with a price discount. It's a product that appears on the front page of the online store. And so that's I would say the second circle is everything that is related to promotions. So that includes a lot of things such as the advertising that you're doing. So for example, exactly what kind of AdWords do you buy from Google to promote certain stuff? What are you, how are you promoting all your product? Because that will explain many of the bumps that you see in the historical sales history. And again, it's if you don't have that, the problem is that if you can see a spike in sales, but you do not know if it was like something that is going to last, like a spike in sales because really the demand did surge, or it was just a spike because you literally send a newsletter to 100,000 of your customer base, putting that as the flagship product prominently figured in the newsletter that explained that, but it means that it will not happen again unless you resend the newsletter where it's featured as prominently as it did happen in the past. And this type of data also probably include for all the e-commerce all the traffic data that they have on the website. And that can be very, very sizable amount of data.
Okay. So let's talk about now some of the current clients that Lokad have. Are there any sort of common mistakes that we've sort of experienced that sort of future customers could perhaps learn from?
I think I would say the biggest mistake, number one, is to choose an ERP or system where data is super hard to extract. You see, that's a sort of, I would say, a terrible vendor lock-in. There are many companies that choose a system where even if it's in-house, they can have a local server that does everything locally, so they think, well, we are in control. That's a machine that is in our offices. It's a server. We have access to it, etc., etc. But the reality is that it's super hard to extract anything because the whole thing has not been properly engineered to make it convenient to extract any data. So it becomes like a gigantic battle to extract anything. I think, for example, for the US market, extracting anything from QuickBooks is just such a massive pain. I'm sorry, Intuit. Intuit is a great company. Don't get me wrong, but extracting anything from QuickBooks is just such it's just incredibly difficult. So that would be probably the mistake number one. Mistake number two is probably not to have like entire gaps of stuff that are not recorded at all. That typically happens for purchase orders, because purchase order you don't have that many. I mean, if you're, I would say, a smallish company, let's say $10 million turnover or something, probably your purchase orders would actually fit on an Excel sheet. You see, because if you reorder, let's say once a month, you have, let's say, 20 suppliers, you reorder once a month. So all in all, we are talking of what, 200 purchase orders per year? Well, that fits on an Excel sheet. But the problem is that if you do not have anything better than an Excel sheet to record them, the day you want to do any kind of lead time analysis, you're kind of screwed, because the data is like spread over dozens of spreadsheets, and it's a bit of a small nightmare. So sometimes you have like a whole gap. Probably the third mistake is not to snapshot the stock levels. Again, hard drives are super cheap. I mean, you can now buy a 1 terabyte hardware for a drive for what, $200 or less. So it's very, very cheap, and there are still a lot of companies where the stock levels, the historical stock levels, are not recorded. So nobody snapshot that. So basically, when we come and we say we want to have the past stock outs or the past low stock situation or these sort of things, well, the data has never been recorded, which is a bit a shame, because all in all, we are talking of max of a couple of gigabytes of data, which literally should cost pennies. So there is not a single reason not to record this data and keep it basically forever.
Okay, and sort of wrap things up, if our clients have one key takeaway from today's discussion, what would it be?
I would say pay attention to your data. It's not necessarily very expensive, but the trick is that the best time to start properly recording all the data that you need is today, because in 3 years, when you need a 3 years history, if you've not started today, you will not have it. So you see, the sort of having a properly historized data is something that you cannot start later. You see, it has to be done now, because if you want 3 years of history, it will reflect a decision that you will have taken 3 years back. So it's not something that you can delegate to the future. Unfortunately, there is many things that you can delegate to. Well, we will do it later. Unfortunately, having proper data is not. And by the way, it does not matter if you're using something as fancy as Lokad to optimize your supply chains. A supply chain manager cannot have the correct decision that falls from the sky. You cannot optimize what you don't measure. It's not a specificity of the statistical algorithm that Lokad use. It also applies to human. If you have no experience and you cannot, you can't rely on anything, then the decision that you will take will not be very good. You cannot just guess how many units you're going to sell for hundreds or thousands of products, if you don't have any data. Just being a competent supply chain practitioner won't save you. So that's probably the one key takeaway is pay attention, and it starts with choosing, I would say, the backbone of your company, so that the software that operate your company, your ERP, etc., to make very sure that you have access to the data. Otherwise, you will be locked into the vendor solution that you've chosen.
Okay, great. Well, yeah, it's a funny sort of answer for someone like me who's very good at sort of mañana and putting it off till tomorrow. So that's everything for this week. We'll be back again next week with another episode. But until then, we'll see you soon. Bye for now.